The time is currently 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Eastern. So we will go ahead and get started. My name is Desmond Martin. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at NextWave STEM, and I am so glad to have you on with us today. We're very excited to really dig into a little bit more depth in this subject of that many of us are really familiar with, NGSS, ISTE, CSTA, Common Core state standards, and thinking about the ways in which STEM curricula can help us reach our goals with our standards. I am super duper excited also to have with us today a special guest, Marcia Bonds, who is a former principal in the Oak Park Public School District in Oak Park, Michigan, to lend a little bit of her expertise with respect to STEM curricula and its implementation at the middle school level particularly. So very excited to jump into everything today. Before I go any further, I do want to lay down just a little bit of our house rules here at NextWave STEM. The first thing is that we are in webinar mode today. That means that we won't be able to hear your face, or I should say see your face or hear your voice. We will, however, be able to get input from you as participants through our chat and through our Q&A functionality. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you really want to chime in, especially during our Q&A section towards the end of our presentation today, feel free to do so at any point during our chat. You can think of this as being more interactive. Yes, me and Marcia will be speaking, but you can also chime in with your expertise and just some thoughts that you have around standards or anything else that we're going to talk about today. Our second bit of information it pertains particularly to our Illinois educators. Today is professional development session for our ISB participants. That means everyone will actually be getting an email following today's webinar with a copy of the slide deck today and a certificate of participation. Currently, we don't have partnerships with other state boards of education for PD hours. However, that's something that we are working on, and we'll be sure to let you know when we're available to provide those PD hours in the future in your particular state. But with all that being said, we're going to go ahead and press on forward because we have a long way to go and a moderate amount of time to get there. The first place that I like to begin is just a little bit more about NextWave STEM. Without focusing so much at all about what's on the slide, our goal at NextWave STEM is really about empowering students through the empowerment of teachers, and particularly with emerging technologies. We are passionate about the idea that students in the classroom today may be the ones that literally save the world, that will use their STEM degrees and expertise, their knowledge and studies like artificial intelligence, robotics, drones, and even 3D printing to solve some massive problems. And we believe that they can solve these problems as they grow to find their own place and space and identities in STEM. I'm super passionate about the idea that the best way to do that is through empowering teachers, especially teachers who may not be super duper familiar with STEM themselves, which is why our goal is really to bring STEM learning and opportunities into all kinds of classrooms. At this point, I just want to take a pause because my colleague, Sugandhi Chigani, who is our school satisfaction specialist, is jumping into the chat. She's helping to moderate the chat today as well. If there is anything that I missed during the course of today's webinar, as you're dropping in comments in the chat, she'll be sure to let us know, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered live on the air. Thanks so much for joining us today, Sugandhi. Now, NextWave STEM, I mentioned that we really do focus on emerging technologies. And we think about this in a few different tracks. The first of which is really a focus on robotics and AI, that hard, impactful, mechanical side of STEM, where students get an opportunity to combine computer science into something tangible in front of them, moving in their space, but also working with drones. We think about drones as a really interesting opportunity to teach about human-machine interfaces in flight dynamics, thinking of physics and mathematics. And finally, 3D printing. 3D printing is an amazing technology that allows us to engage in the engineering design process and close the design loop, something that our students really learn about, especially with iterative design and product manufacturing at NextWave STEM. And what that means for us is that we've gone on this journey now for 3 years where we have developed curricula that aligns with NGSS grade bands, really help empower students through empowering you in the classroom as teachers. We'll talk a little bit more about what NextWave STEM offers a little bit later on in our webinar. So I'd love to take this time to introduce our guest today, Marsha Bonds. You know a little bit more about me because you've been getting some emails from me about what's going on, and you're going to get an email from me after today. But I'd like to focus on Marsha a little bit. She spent 17 years in the classroom in her time in Oak Park Public Schools, but also 5 years as an administrative personnel, as an assistant principal and also as a principal. She's facilitated professional development in Common Core ELA and math, and cultural responsive teaching, which has found really thankfully a invigorated passion amongst educators in 2020, and also in restorative practices. Marsha, can you open up your camera and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Good evening. I'd like to, but my camera, it says I'm unable to start video.
Okay. Well, we'll roll with the punches as is the theme of 2020.
And that's fine. Thank you so much, Desmond. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being here this evening. As Desmond has said, I am a retired educator, loving that part of it right now. I spent 17 years in the classroom teaching in elementary and middle school. And I also spent years as an assistant principal and a principal. I have facilitated PD, as he said, on Common Core ELA and math. I've also done instructional learning cycle, reading, writing, and math workshop in the classroom, small groupings in the classroom, and the restorative practices most recently. I am grateful and happy to be here this evening.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking that time just to tell us a little bit more about yourself. We're grateful to have you with us as you're bringing a really particular kind of perspective, not necessarily a tech ed specialist, but someone who has been integrating technical and STEM curricula into your classroom thinking and into your delivery for quite some time during the course of your career. So we're glad to have you and glad to have you bringing your perspective. With all that being said, we will jump right into it. And what we want to talk about now is our goals. You've given us an hour. What are the 2 things that we really want to focus on? The first is that we want to get a deeper understanding of STEM-related standards across a spectrum of disciplines. You'll hear us refer to more than a few different standards bodies, and even the idea that there are some really interesting and nuanced ways in which those standards can interplay with each other. We want to get an overall sense of what those standards mean. How can they empower students? Their focus for us as actual educators. How do they play in with one another? But then after we get a sense of the interplay between standards, especially what they're meant to accomplish, we want to talk specifically about how curricula can satisfy those standards, but not just checking off boxes and helping us get to where we want to go in our assessments, but thinking more deeply about how we're developing holistic learning in students. This is something that we've striven for as educators for hundreds of years, really the entirety of the time that human beings have been trying to educate other human beings. How can we make more complete learners and more complete people? And that's something that we can really accomplish through the use of STEM careers, so through the use of STEM curricula. So I'm really excited to talk more with Marsha about how that will work today. So the first idea we want to dig into are, what are the standards and why should we care? And I'm a playful person by heart. I love a good joke. And you'll see this bowl of alphabet soup. Many times we think about the standards and we see acronyms, NGSS, ST, ITEA. We'll think about Common Core, ELA, Math and Science, 21st Century Skills, and our acronyms can sometimes jumble together into our heads. So we have to kind of parse things out, understand where we're asked to specialize, and really tell the difference between the goals of our standards, how they help us get to where we want to go. So briefly, I just want to do an overview of some really common standards adaptations. We have representatives from multiple states here on the call with us today, but there's some really commonly adopted standards. And the first one that everyone knows really well is Common Core state standards. Common Core is kind of what it sounds like. It's designed to build this idea that there is a not even bare minimum, but diverse and varied way that we can make sure that our students, as they're learning ELA and mathematics, are college and career ready across a wide spectrum. We're thinking K through 12 education, and that's an education that really prepares you for a world that's changed as we've entered into our fourth industrial revolution. What do standards cover? Two specific domains with NGSS, English and language arts, and along with the mathematics as well. When we're thinking about ELA, college and career readiness, our taxonomical buildup as we move up through grade levels in our standards, regardless if it's K5, 6, 12, or specific focus on science and technical subjects, it's based on these four ideas. The ability to recognize key issues and details, the ability to craft and build structure in your English and writing skills, the ability to integrate knowledge and ideas, and the ability to explore and expand your range of text and textual complexity. And the goals in the ELA actually feed into and are informed by the mathematics standards as well, which focus on 8 particular areas of mathematical practice, what we consider to be a foundational domain of math skill which is built up taxonomically as well. The Common Core takes math and reading, says what are the things that you've got to be proficient in to be college and career ready once you're done with that secondary education, and really lays that out in a very broad spectrum. Many of our states. Now, I think the number is sitting at around 40, and I have to double check my figures there, have adapted Common Core standards as state standards in some form or another. Which leads me now to pivot to NGSS, because after Common Core adoption, we see NGSS being adopted at a very, very rapid pace since its inception. So the question, what is the NGSS? The National Research Council framework of K through 12 science education, a really strong piece of writing done by National Research Council of Washington, D.C., spent really robust time and learned about the best practices on the state level, was trying to project what was going to be happening in the future with scientific exploration, and even was comparing our US students' science skills and efficacy with respect to instruction. When we think about the tertiary outcomes, students who are enrolling in STEM fields, students that are prepared to go into industry from those STEM fields, they took all these ideas and built a framework for science education that details core ideas, science and engineering principles, and cross-cutting concepts around 4 particular domains. It's an effective way for you to select technologies and subjects that were really relevant to the scientific experience and academic life of your students going forward, but it also really focuses on their ability to learn through inquiry and problem solving. What we would learn that's so important is that You could have the technical domain covered all day long, but if you can't solve problems with this technical skill set, it doesn't really do you very much good. So what do the standards cover? Our four core content areas: physical sciences, earth and space, life sciences, and engineering technology, and the application of sciences really are asking our questions fundamental and then taxonomically more engaging questions about how the world works around us. When we go into the middle school space, we have this extra component that's added on with engineering design. And that's super exciting for me as a professional mechanical engineer by training. It's the chance now to take the science, the technology, and the mathematics students learn about and apply them towards solutions. This is really a passion of mine personally, and something that we love doing here at NextWave STEM. So now that we've got kind of those big two that are covered, going very quickly, being mindful of the time, we're thinking about the Computer Science Teachers Association and their CSTA standards as well. I believe we have some members who are, or some participants today who are members of CSTA. Hi, thanks for joining us on the call. It's a pleasure to have you with us. CSTA is really, really interesting and is differentiated a little bit from the NGSS in that it's designed specifically for comprehensive computer science from the perspective of pedagogical content knowledge. The PCAC, that idea that you've got your three measures of the Venn diagram, and pedagogy, content, and actual subject matter knowledge that meet together. But it's also beautiful because it really lives at the bleeding edge of computer science. In many ways, the CSTA standards are also designed to be aspirational goals for professional development. How are you not only a better teacher, but how do you build in that improved teaching pedagogy into learning more technical and varied and increasingly new skills in computer science? And the way that you continue to do that is to build professionally. CSD offers a really robust framework to allow us to do that. So when we think about empowering teachers, and I know this is a little bit wordy, we are building in these effective K-12 CS practices. Can we demonstrate thorough CS knowledge and skills? Do we know Java? Do we know Python? Do we know Ruby on Rails? Can we put these things together in such a way that allows our students to move with mastery in some very different domains, whether that's integrating our code into robotics, into physical input output, working with AI, or building websites, and on and on and on. We want to make sure that there's a breadth of skill there. But we also want to pull together evidence-based practica with responsive classroom practices. Is it stale? Is it creating a situation that locks other students out who may have been historically underrepresented in computer science? We have to design the learning experience using pedagogical content knowledge. Not only do I know the technical skill, but do I know how to teach the technical skill? The amazing thing about computer science is that there's some pedagogical overlap between language arts, especially when acquiring second languages. That becomes really good pedagogy in computer science as well. Can we make those work and grow in our teaching ability? Can we also develop our own personal, or I should say professional identity? Am I the coding teacher that knows three languages and have only known the three languages for the last few years, even though we have a new language update that's come out? Am I still teaching HTML3 when students have been working on HTML5 for years and HTML6 is fast approaching? We have to continue to grow. And then we have to advocate for equity and inclusion in the CS classroom. Do my practical skills, my pedagogy allow me to make the classroom inviting for the entire community? CSTA empowers our teachers to create curricula that does that in abundance. But lest we forget about those who are really focused on ed tech, those hands-on experiences with integrative material. Integrative meaning, in this case, things that we just don't look at on our screen. We have the International Society for Technology and Education Standards, ISTE. which has been doing tremendous work for quite some time. The ISTE standards also tap into the TPAC, Technical Pedagogical Content Knowledge Structure. This really amazing cross-section of being able to understand the technological skills, the ability to teach, and the actual psychology that goes into the teaching of your students, and the content knowledge. And it's just also beautiful because it supports Common Core State standards and CSTA standards as well. We're bringing our actual classroom technology tools, whether that's smart boards or jam boards or iPads, and it brings it to your actual content skills, teaching about earth sciences, life sciences, or the engineering design space, and actually allows your students to collaborate. It expands the toolkit of your students and of you as the teacher. So when we think about the actual ISTE standards and what they're designed to accomplish, they're designed to give us the opportunities that we see example here, where students are holistic learners. They're collaborative. It's very, very important that they're able to work together to do things like programming in a drone, simulating a flight around school. But as they're doing this, they're not just working with the machine, they're thinking about being a digital citizen in a larger sense. What does it mean to have a drone with a camera flying? What does it mean to actually measure out the space of the classroom or the expanding room? What does it mean to have to think computationally about the mathematics of programming in the flight completely? What do we have to consider with respect to ethics and even our own school culture and code of conduct? And how can we communicate what we're doing to those who are not only evaluating us, but to those who we seek to help with this work? ISTE standards really help our students get to those places where their knowledge just doesn't live in a vacuum, but is actually applicable. So hit you with a fire hose of information. Like I said, we kind of ate from the alphabet soup there. And I guess I want to ask Ms. Bonds a question now, Marcia. In your estimation, what do all these standards have in common? Where do all these live and what's the cross section?
I think that one of the things that we always have to remember is that the cross section actually is with our students. Um, all the language, all the alphabet soup that you talked about does help us a lot. It helps us it guides us in the direction that we're supposed to go for those 21st century skills. However, one of the things that we have to look at is where does that work in the classroom? How does that work in the classroom? And that's not only a question for us as educators. It's actually a question we need to ask our students, because we have to build those connections and those bridges from what our students actually know. And a lot of times they know a lot, but they don't know where it belongs in the standards. And sometimes we struggle with that. Where is what they know? How does that apply to the standards that we know? Those bridges and those connections always matter. I am basically ELA to my heart. I love math and science, but ELA to my heart. And I always believe that everything crosses there. We talk about novels and all those things, but a lot of the reading is done in math and in science also. So we've got to take a look at everything together. And although it's a difficult alphabet soup to say the least, it is something that we need to do. And we really have got to take a look at it through the lens of how can I put this in my classroom in the time that I have.
That's a really powerful statement, because I think you're hitting the nail on the head when you think about 21st century skills. And I couldn't agree with you more that our focus when we think about STEM education and how STEM relates to our responsibilities in our various states, in our various school districts and standards, is at the beginning and end of the day, they're designed to serve the students. They're designed to serve the students in preparation. They're designed to serve the students to prepare them for the world that we couldn't even imagine. They're designed to prepare us and prepare our students for what 2021 might bring, considering that this time last year, we had no idea that the vast majority of our instruction during 2020 would be remote. We have to be flexible and create flexible students as well. And that means creating these different literacies, these different skill sets. And I think that you're really hitting on something important there that we're going to continue to return to as we think about curricular instruction and implementation. That's so rich. Um, and since you mentioned it, we actually have this lovely slide here for those of us who may not be familiar with the 21st century skills. Those of us who have spent some kind of time in the classroom are potentially really familiar with the 4 C's, those learning skills. And I have to say, and maybe you can relate to this, Marcia, as well. I've gone to conferences and seen over and over and over again sessions, really good sessions, really engaging sessions about the 4 C's, those learning skills: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. We have designed entire curricula. We have set up frameworks around those learning skills. But I think the reason we've done that is that at some level, we have considered that it is the school's job to really only empower our students' ability to learn. That if our students come away from our schools, specifically with the ability to be critical thinkers, to be creative, to collaborate, and to communicate their work well, then we've done our due diligence. And I really think that we are kind of missing the boat on literacy and life skills. So I kind of want to rest here for a little bit and ask you, when you think about STEM curricula particularly, what kind of consideration do you give to those literacy and life skills?
I don't find, I found over time that separating them does not work well. When we start to work in isolation with those skills, we don't build students and we don't build ourselves. As educators, we've been thrown into this too. So, you know, you're in a classroom and a year ago, you weren't planning on being this technologically literate. You may have been on your way there, but not quite there yet. So when you have those skills have got to be built. And I think that if you separate them away, and that's one of the things that always creates a problem, because we have when we do it in the classroom, when we do it in learning, our students start to think that way. We don't want them thinking in small boxes. We want them to be holistic in their thinking. We want them to understand that those problem solving skills apply to life, they apply to science, they apply to math. Just like, you know, very often one of the funniest stories I have is kids who tell me they're not going to ever use math in life, which is, you know, really interesting. It's you'd be amazed at how many stories I have about that, about people not, you know. But the idea is that kind of thinking is kind of falls back on the agricultural model that we had before. We need to move forward, and we've got to build and integrate those things. And we've got to make sure that we're not teaching in isolation. You know, if we remember that in life, we've got to be critical thinkers, that even in ELA, if I'm reading a story, I need to think critically about the characters in that story and what's going on, the plot and all those things. I've got to think critically the same way I do with a science experiment. I've got to be able to think holistically. How does this work? Where am I coming from? Where am I at? And where am I going?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to think about the narrative structure of learning. And in those narrative structures, we find that there can be really many twists and turns, uh, especially in the context of STEM, where we have the opportunity to fail a lot. I have to confess that I'm a big fan of failure. We have all of us experienced failure in some kind of context at NextWave STEM or in our personal lives or even in our professional lives. And failure breeds inherently this opportunity to grow in some of these other skills, not just our 4 C's and our learning skills, but also in our literacy skills. Thinking about what we missed, thinking about even where these stories are coming from and where we're getting the information that we're getting. Thinking about the way that the technologies, the media itself, the medium, whether that's through my book or my computer, how that affects my learning. That those kind of things help us build a stronger, more resilient narrative over time.
And we've also got to understand that we have to teach children how to fail.
Mm.
Because if everything is built on success, then when there is failure, and we all know that you are more likely, anything that you do, you're more likely to hit that wall a few times than you are to be successful the first time. And so once we teach them that, then they learn how to move forward, what to do. They don't become stagnant, they don't stop, they don't become locked down because they've made a mistake or an error. That's why we've got to be more holistic in the way we think about it. There are so many ways to apply these skills in life. If we don't build the bridges and the connections for students, then they're not going to have them very often. They know so much, and all they need to know is how they know it. They may not have the language for it. So we've got to be able to build that language. So we've got to really build that language for them. You know, and you and I once talked about a drone. You know, I might say, well, I know how to build it. It may turn left if I do this and turn right. And you were saying, you know, you've got to know how to, then you should tell them, well, that's a yaw. So you've got to be able to tell them what that language is. But when you talk about building bridges, it's about building those language bridges too.
Yeah, that's a really robust way to integrate it and think about what we're teaching, not just in terms of ELA, but also our technical language and how those things serve each other. Jessica actually put in a really, really good comment here. I'm going to read this one aloud, Jessica. I love this idea here, where you say you always want to learn math by using some sports references. I'm a huge sports fan myself. I'm originally from Detroit, so I don't have very many good things to say about my sports heritage, but that's neither here nor there. She said that she wanted to learn math by using some sports references. So math was tied to the real world. That became something that you wanted that classroom experience to deal with what was really interesting to you. Think you would have liked math more or believed it was relevant to life, and you started with something relevant to students. And starting with what the student knows and building from there, especially when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching, becomes a very, very powerful tool.
Interesting, Jessica. In my learning in the earlier part of my life, I learned math by baseball and figuring out how baseball teams placed and how they ended up a game ahead or a half game behind. That's how I really started to think, how my mind expanded on thinking about math.
So, and that becomes a really, really common story where we see like basic computational skills, fractional sense, number sense, through a sport like baseball come to the fore. I've heard so many of those stories, especially in a sport as statistically heavy as baseball is, to say nothing about advanced metrics and stats and on base percentage and OPS and all of that really, really cool nerdy stuff that scorekeepers love. It's about finding the things that matter to our students to be able to want to quantify mathematically, but also want to describe in ways that our language that excite our lives. Why do we care about this? Why is this exciting to you? What do you want to do with this? How do you want to help someone? How do you want to help yourself? All these things really relate together in some beautiful ways. I kind of want to dig into an example here where we think about problem solving coming forward and how we might want to pull forward those other skills, those life skills that we see defined in the 21st century skills in the context of something that we work with in STEM. And in this case, it's really useful to think about the engineering design context. I have this engineering background, and I will admit it creates a bias. When we think about what engineering is, if I were to give you a very simple definition, you'd just be using science, technology, and mathematics to solve problems for people. And the amazing thing is that we're very, very good, people that is, at creating problems for ourselves. So we want to use some tools to solve those problems. If I were really focusing on a STEM lesson with engineering at its core, problem solving is coming to the front, which is a really, really critical skill that we think about in the 4 C's, but also builds into those literacy skills and life skills as well. So when we think about the distinguishing characteristics of engineering design in the next generation science standards, for an example, we're building on the K through 5 and K through 8 core subject material to higher orders of thinking. And then we're creating scenarios that are really well suited to PBL, problem-based learning methodologies. Something that we're not talking a lot about today is specifics of instructional models. But I will hint and say that I'm a big fan of problem-based learning because of its longitudinal nature and the student-driven shift of problem-based learning, where students really become self-driving in their learning. Um, but the interesting thing is we're always looking for these opportunities to shift from, okay, I'm going to tell you how it's done and I want you to practice that, to exploring your options and how can you as a student do it. Marcia, are there other lessons or other experiences that you've had even from the world of English learning where you're encouraging your students to really just make that paradigm shift, where before we might have been taught pedagogically, it's sage on the stage and then repeat, and now we're really turning this towards student-driven learning. What is a really good example there that you can kind of integrate for us?
One of the things that it's very interesting. So often and as educators, we're pressed for time.
Mm.
And so we tend to do more than we need to.
Hmm.
I
That's
learned to
interesting.
I mean, we do, because and what happens is, because if we would ever just front end it, we could do a lot less going along, but that time is never there. We're always running and always trying to do more. But one of the things that helps us so much is to allow the students to do the work, shift the power dynamic to the student, and start to allow them to talk and ask questions. But the only way we can do that is we have to take a step back and breathe, because it's very difficult because you have to give them that time, and everything has to be okay. Everything has to be okay to be put on the table. If they ask a question, and of course it takes you modeling this in the classroom. There's a continual modeling of this. Well, what is it that you think this is? How do you think this works? And sometimes in asking those questions, what I found is I had a student answer me and tell me, we were specifically talking about a math problem. And I'm not one to be stuck in how you solve that problem, or even in science. In elementary school, not stuck on how you solve it. You tell me how you think you can, and kind of let them work through it. And then as they start to move towards, there may be an error you see coming. It's kind of like, well, if this happens, what are you going to do? That's how we start to build that. But it's very time consuming, and
Mm.
it's difficult in a classroom where you're pressed for time. But for us, and moving forward, if we're talking about advancing technological skills, advancing that holistic learning, making sure our students understand and building those bridges, that's what we've got to do. The standards actually help us with that. If we can parse out the wording and put it
Mm.
into actual practice.
Yeah, that's really, really good. This idea that there's got to be a paradigm shift for our students, but also for ourselves first. Um, and that requires time and requires pep. I know that's something that literally everybody struggles with. Where do I find the hours into the day to make the shift? But if we can find and carve out that time and really refine our approach, I think that we're in a great situation here. So
When
that's
we look at
that's
it,
that's a useful
yeah,
insight.
when we look at instructional learning, we can do it. We can actually do it. We really have to shift our own paradigm away from where we've got to go to
Hmm,
where we are.
sure.
Because if we figure out where we are, we can get to where we've got to go a lot faster if we allow the students to do the work.
Right, right. And Susan again is talking about the love for PBL. This ability now to not necessarily drill the skill, but say, okay, let's establish a framework in which you're interested in growing the skill. Um, it may grow from the perspective of what's sitting at the end for you, really going to change, how are we going to help or change the situation. But it also may sit from the framework of what do you want to know. Is the reward for learning this new thing going to be satisfactory for you, and how we model that in the classroom becomes a potentially life-changing experience for students who may not see that very, very often. I wanted to take a shift here and dig into some examples using emerging technologies. That's something that we've shied away from a little bit, but that's really in our wheelhouse at NextWave STEM. We believe that it's not just the quote unquote traditional science, math classes, and now this new idea of using ed tech, basically using iPads or your small robotics kit. Or maybe some of us have had very little to no experience with engineering education at all. We want to get into this idea that emerging technologies actually are not beyond our student populations. That yes, even our students with very little to no experience, yes, even our instructors with very little to no experience, have these opportunities to work with technologies that may be foundational to future work that they do, not just at the tertiary level, beyond high school, but even in their careers. I want to talk a little bit about emerging technologies and just a couple of examples that we have here at NextWave STEM. So at NextWave STEM, the scenario that we would really invest in is trying to bring curricula, empower the teachers through professional development, and also equipment in courses like drones and 3D printing. If you're not familiar with either drones or 3D printing, that's okay. I've done just a really brief description of what is accomplished when we use these physical technologies. When we think about using drones, we're integrating computer science, math, and engineering principles at the same time. For those of us who have a little bit more experience with robots, robots are still fairly new. They've only been used in mass production for about 65-ish years, and in the way that we think about modern robotics. But the amazing thing about robots is that they're not just earthbound. A drone, for all intents and purposes, is a flying robot. So now we're bringing in this really advanced way in which our students are able to move machinery through space and explore the applications that they have. When students learn how to fly drones, they're learning programming because they're not just operating a joystick. There's lots of value in that as well, but they're flying these drones autonomously. They're dragging and dropping and writing code. They're simulating flights. A lot of our students right now do not have access to equipment because of remote learning scenarios. And that means that they're using the actual technical platform provided in our courses to fly these drones in virtual space at home. And they're constructing these use case scenarios for real applications. Kind of in that same vein, when we're working with 3D printing, we're integrating some interesting disciplines. Exploring computer-aided design, and that's where we talk a little bit more about STEAM, integrating arts education into our technical learning. And of course, closing that engineering design loop. How do I apply what I know about science, technologies, and math to solve problems for people? Students are engaging in cloud-based design. They don't have to download super robust software as long as they have an internet connection, and not necessarily even a stable internet connection. They can design objects from their homes, Chromebooks, Macs, iOS, even Linux. if you're that kind of school district, you are able to do design. We're closing the loop once again with the design process, and even connecting with remote printing services or connecting to the real printer that you have in your school to make objects. We're doing these things. In the case of drones, the field has only gotten robust in about the last 20 years. 3D printing is a 40-year-old industry, so it's barely older than we are. And the question becomes, okay, once again, when you think about the NGSS, how do these standards build the skills? Not just our creative thinking skills or our literacy skills, but even our life skills. If the standard is telling me that we have to plan and conduct an investigation and provide some evidence of, in this case, forces, or if I'm working with my middle schoolers and they have to analyze tests to really do some comparison and some contrasting between design solutions. Or if I'm even thinking about my high school, where they have to where they have to simulate or test a solution to mitigate adverse impacts on human activity or biodiversity. In this case specifically, imagine using a drone and coding a drone to serve the purpose as a pollinator. Really different and diverse tasks that our students might be working with. Really different and diverse opportunities. Where are the other places where we can build those bridges? Where are the other places where we can build some of those life skills? Marcia, I know we're kind of hitting you with a whole lot of information here. But as an educator, as an administrator, where would you love to see your students start, um, even at your middle, elementary, or high school? What are those other kind of connections you would love to build?
I think that one of the things is one of the issues that we ran into is the changing technology from elementary to middle school, just the time
Mm,
that passed. We need to start very early.
yes.
Um, at kindergarten level, kids can do something, and they can do, and if we start to teach them the language, then they move up, we can actually advance a lot further. So if I think about life skills, I want them to be able to see. If I get a drone for Christmas as a student and I want to fly it around and I can attack my brothers and sisters with it accurately, I need to understand what that means and how I can use it in the way you were talking about. How can I use it in nature? How can I use it in those different ways? That to me, it still goes back to building those bridges from what a student actually knows to building it into a life skill with the appropriate language and the steps that it actually took them to get there. Because a lot of times you'll ask the students, say, I don't know. And I
Mhm.
don't know. They actually do know.
Mm,
They don't have the language to tell you what it is or how they got there. And so if as educators we hear what they're saying and we can tell them, well, no, this is what that is, and take them step by step through it, we'll find out that there are probably a lot more that they may know more than we do in a lot of cases. Or at least they can build the skills that they have into relevant, connectable, actionable skills
yes.
and
Yes.
technology.
Relevant, connectable, actionable. And you said something right at the top there that I really hadn't even considered, but you're really right about our alphabet soup, especially when it comes to STEM. And we think about the taxonomical ability of our students, their actual cognitive ability. We're just now, probably in the last 10 or so years, as an industry, recognizing what you just said, that our kindergartners, our firsts, our seconds, actually have the ability to think logically about a lot of the skill sets that will dovetail out into these different STEM disciplines as they're working with technology. There, and we actually at NextWave STEM acknowledge and address a little bit of that in our K through 2 courses. When you think about, for example, learning how to use a drone and the way the technology changes, that's absolutely right. Um, as we grow, we're going to grow into different skills. We may be programming using Scratch at the middle school level, and we may be using Python, for example, at the high school level. But we're still using that underlying programmatic knowledge of giving a machine instructions, and we can teach children, Ks, ones, and twos, for example, the expectation that what they learn in a game, like Simon Says, can also apply around them in their constructed world. That coding is a way of playing Simon Says with my computer and with my machines. And if I can understand a little bit the ways in which machines play Simon Says, then we can grow more and more into using a technology like this. That early on understanding is a really, really powerful point.
And it does. I mean, we teach, we have a tendency to believe that we've got to wait until they can understand the language when we just need to make the language where they can understand it. There is a difference. I mean, a couple of things I can think about, just even that they're not necessarily technology based, but elementary kids, kindergartners know how to do fractions.
Mm,
If
mm,
you ask them to divide up a Skittles pack, they can do it. They don't understand that that's what they're doing. So, I mean, something as simple as that. So if you move that into technology, thinking about what coding can do, and even if we go to tell the left arm to do this or tell the drone to fly
mm.
left, we can tell them that and tell them how to do it. Then we're building on skills that they're going to be able to use later.
Yes, absolutely. Really scaffolding up that understanding of the logic and underlying processes becomes indispensable, absolutely indispensable for our students. Um, it's interesting. Really interesting question coming in from Jessica here. And Marsha, I think you might be able to help us with this understanding here. Are educators using the term constructivism anymore? She says that that was a focus of her master's ed program. Marcia, are your colleagues in Oak Park still focused on constructivism in with respect to their pedagogical growth?
That is coming back around.
Mm.
And let me just say, in my experience, and not just in Oak Park, in a lot of places, a lot of the work where I've done work in our county, in the county that I worked in. And constructivism was something that I learned and it sort of faded away. And now it's coming back because that's exactly what this is. We've got to, if that's what you're focused on, thank goodness to your instructors and your professors. Thank goodness, because that is what we need to do. It goes and comes, and this is one of the times, it's one of the things that really is necessary for building that next level skill set. So absolutely.
Awesome. And for those of us who are wondering about that formalized definition of constructionalism or constructivism, sorry, I'm mixing my syllables a little bit. A theory in education that recognizes learners' understanding and knowledge based on their own experiences prior to entering school. Also, really, really important when we think about a culturally responsive teaching. It goes beyond just the learning domain that we thought about before, but also into our literacy domains and our life skills domains as well. That really is, I couldn't say it more enough, is more and more centered at the heart of really robust STEM education, but just good teaching pedagogy generally.
It is, and I don't think that constructivism ever went out of style, and I should probably temper that. I think that what happens is, as we start, as educators, as we start to look at the standards and the alphabet soup, we lose the time factor that's necessary to build those skills and make those connections. We also have to know what our students' foundation is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We spend that time, but knowing our students and really getting to know our students. And I have kind of a little slide to think about that a little bit more, because as we talked before, we had this really interesting question that came up when we think about STEM education and one of the particular challenges of STEM education. Um, this slide focuses kind of on that same exercise, thinking about how we might think of standards applying even in the domain of using a different technology, a really different technology like 3D printing, but we're running a little bit late on time. So I'm going to skip this for now, just to say that even though the technology changes, we still have these really interesting opportunities to build our skills, whether that's a focus on the computer science, if we were doing an AI generated part on a 3D printer, or is that the focus on the social sciences and social studies that we might pull out of a 3D printer? Can I model and simulate a real life artifact, for example, that would be either inaccessible or unethical for me to access by using some generative design on a 3D printer? The technologies may differ, but our ability to address these 21st century skills is really, really strong across the board. So I want to talk a little bit about potential pitfalls, and one pitfall in particular. This one thing that kind of sticks out of us, is yelling at us, as sometimes we get in heated conversations with our staff and administrations about. Oftentimes we'll come to these webinars and we say, okay, this is great, fine and good, but I have something that kind of sits at the bottom and the top of what I'm being told by those I'm accountable to. And that question is, what about assessments? This is great, Desmond. You want to do learning skills and literacy and life skills. How are we going to assess it? And I kind of want to turn that question over to you, Marcia. How do we assess 21st century skills? Should we assess 21st century skills? What do we do with this idea of knowing where our students are?
Assessments are always so difficult because the idea, let's go with what Jessica was talking about, constructivism.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually learner centered. And she's made the statement to everybody. Assessments are standard centered.
Mm,
Our
indeed, they
formative
are.
assessments can always build on that constructivist attitude. But what happens is, and this is just a real thing. What happens is time. And when time gets in the way, we tend to teach away from that and teach to an assessment or around an assessment and to the way we're going to assess instead of changing the way we assess to the way we teach. So, what about assessments? We have to make sure that what we do in the classroom fits the assessment.
Mm,
That doesn't always make us comfortable, but here's the thing about it. All of this is possible if we create assessments that balance what we know students know, where we are with students, and what they need to know.
mhm.
And that's the best answer I can give, because assessment is really, that's always, although it is a necessity and is sometimes the monster that we live with. Sometimes it's a great thing, and sometimes it just, kind of makes things a little bit more difficult. So those summative assessments have to be, yeah, yes, Jessica. A lot of people are afraid of how to assess project-based learning, and PBL can be assessed in the best ways.
Mhm.
But it takes more work initially. It does not take more work in the long run. That's that student agency, that ownership.
Mm,
But for me to let it go in a room where I'm being evaluated and there are a lot of evaluation comes through a lot of different lenses. And it kind of comes from, if you have someone who understands what project-based learning is, how students do learn, what can happen there. I don't think any teacher is really afraid of that kind of assessment as much as they are wondering how that's going to affect their evaluation. And you have to balance that.
absolutely. And I think that you're saying it right, that um, we have to embrace a paradigm once again that says that we know that these assessments not only have to be done or good to be done when we think about the summative assessments. I love formative assessments. We kind of live in our bread and butter at NextWave STEM around the formative assessment and not being so focused on, for lack of a better terminology, trying to pin a grade on the student, but more so about using their student-driven agency in order to build their skills and reaffirming that, while also reaffirming and creating safe spaces for them to fail as well. That we believe really gives the greatest learning opportunities. The long story made short here is, I think that we also need to really wrap our heads around different ways in which we reform our assessments and what those mean for student success. That's a huge structural kind of conversation that we can't have today because we are rapidly running out of time. But we'll be sure to continue that conversation a little bit later on. So now that we've kind of hit you with that fire hose of information, we have to think about, okay, what can we do to help you here at NextWave STEM? Well, I mentioned before that we are a curriculum provider for STEM material in robotics, artificial intelligence, drones and coding, and 3D technology. And you kind of see the spectrum of 11 courses that we're offering right now for licensing. But they are courses that are distinct in their taxonomical rigor and in the goals that are really being focused on. They take into account that learners may be completely new to this technology that they're learning about. So they're introductory, but they're building us to some real goals as we go. And if you choose to work with NextWave STEM, we're more than happy not just to sell you materials, but also make sure that you've got the equipment that you need, professional development and trainings and certification for this course so that you're able to execute the course with fidelity and with confidence, knowing that you are absolutely going to have what you need as you continue towards your goal. Um, And don't worry, I know I'm kind of advancing through these slides quickly. We're going to be emailing out the slides to everyone after the webinar today. So you're going to get a copy of this one. I see you, Jessica. We're going to make sure you got what you need. And we have taken some time, really needed time in 2020 to make sure that our curricula is functional both during school time, out of school time, asynchronously, in person, and remote. The future is unknown in a lot of different dimensions when we think about what learning in the modality, whether in person or continued virtual learning, kind of like what we're doing here, will continue. We want to make sure that we have you something that will work. Anissa asks, is the PowerPoint going to be shared? The answer is yes. I would have loved to do a Q&A with everyone, but we've run out of time. So I want to take some time to thank Marcia. Thank you so much for joining us today and just lending your knowledge and your expertise to what we do at NextWave STEM and what you're doing and what you have been doing working with students. If you would love to contact me to learn a little bit more about NextWave STEM or get in touch with one of our school partnership specialists, you can contact me. My email is really simple, desmond@nextwavestem.com. We're on all major social media platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. We don't have a TikTok. I neither tick nor do I talk, but we might get an intern one day who could work on that for us. To Marcia, thank you so much again. Do you have any parting words for our guest today?
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time to always share with educators. I would always say, follow your heart, because that's where education is.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those wise words. For everyone following their hearts as they continue to educate students, even during really difficult times, we are thankful for you. We appreciate you. And we're hoping that during this holiday season, you find some rest, some safety, and some ways to continue to find joy in what we do. We're looking forward to connecting with educators in our free webinar series in 2021, and we'll be letting you know when our next session is. But until then, everyone be safe, be well, and we will see you next year. Bye-bye now.